Okay, we are recording. All right, so welcome back, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll show the code as we left it last week, and then we can pick up from there. Okay, and it looks like I'm sharing screen too. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Great.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So just a really quick review, and I know we ran out of time last week because it's a 40-minute Zoom. So I went super fast over the last 10-20 lines of code. So we'll just do a quick review, but again, the code is there, the video is there, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. So we started with a file I'm calling now Pi100 requests. I think I had called it V1 last week, and then this one was V2. I renamed them just to give them slightly better names. Again, naming is important. We're going to talk about that hopefully today or on our next session, how to pick good names for variables and functions and stuff like that, and files for that matter. So the Pi100 file just does an import on requests. It's got a token and a URL stored in environment variables. And then it just uses request.get to, again, just as a quick example, to fetch one user, print that user's login, that user is me, print that user's login, and then also do a quick paginate example, again, also using requests. By comparison, the Pi session looks very similar. It's roughly the same length, but it creates what's called a request session, which allows you to, among other things, set the authorization header once by doing it here instead of doing it every time you call an Okta API method. So it becomes a little shorter. You'll notice this one doesn't say headers and this one doesn't say headers. So it's done once at the top, and then you don't have to repeat it. The other advantage to this, and actually I will demonstrate this today, and I should have done this last time, but is it runs a lot faster. So let's take a look. We're going to run the Pi requests first, just to kind of see a quick visualization of what kind of speed it's running at, and then we'll compare that to the session. Notice the session is probably 50 to 100% faster. So that's always nice. I like speed. So if I run requests, you'll notice it's going to start spitting out users here in a second. There we go. Okay. And you can see it does a page like every minute, second and a half or something. You can see the URL here at the bottom. And again, as a quick recap of what we talked about last week, this is basically calling the phone number, if you will. I'm using a phone analogy, asking for information, hanging up the phone, calling back, asking information, hanging up the phone, calling back, etc. Saying hello and goodbye and all that good stuff. Whereas this one, hopefully it'll give you a good feel for the speed. And let's connect and let's see. Okay, notice it's a little zippier. This one calls once, doesn't hang up the phone, and just says, give me the next page, give me the next page, give me the next page. So it runs a little faster, doesn't hang up the phone and call back in between. So that's a nice thing. I think I'm always all about performance. Well, amongst other things, readability, performance, there's lots of criteria. So any questions on that? Any oohs and ahs? Are we amazed? Are we impressed?
What's your second method? Does that affect like API limits or anything?
It could potentially, yeah, and that's actually one of the potential downsides of doing this is that sometimes the code runs so fast that then you have to add delays to slow it down so that you don't run into rate limit errors. And we're going to talk about rate limits today, actually, so that's a perfect segue into some of the topic for today. But for the most part, doing something like pagination, you won't really see any issues with rate limits because like for example, this endpoint, at least on my tenant, you can call it 600 times a minute, and that would be 10 times per second if you're doing the math. As you can see, we're getting nowhere near that level of performance. In fact, each page takes about 1 second, so we would be hitting maybe 60 out of the 600 or 10% of the rate limits. But yes, in general, there are some situations where if you start making faster calls or so many calls that you will actually have to slow down in order to avoid those rate limits. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit, but yeah, very good question. One thing to keep in mind is that pagination, by its very nature, the way Okta does it, you have to do it one page at a time. Page one has a link right here to page two, and page two has a link to page three, and page three has a link to page four, and so on and so forth. So you have to do them one at a time. There are other API endpoints though, and there are other valid use cases. And again, perhaps we can talk about some of those today, where you can make multiple requests at the same time. I'll give you an example. Let's say, and I'll just do this in pseudocode for now. Perhaps we'll flesh that out. Pseudocode, by the way, for those folks who don't know, is not real code. It looks kind of like code, but it's not something that you would execute. I'm just using code as an example of something. So let's say I was able to say for user of users, and again, I had fetched, sorry, in users, for user in users, and I had fetched users somehow. And now I want to say for each user, fetch the factors for that user. So I want to say get, user factors. And if you already have it, let's say if you've already paginated the users, you've already fetched them, there's no reason why you can't do this multiple users at a time. So in that situation, yes, you will definitely get rate limit warnings unless you intentionally slow the code down, or you happen to have super duper fast infinite rate limits, which I think you can actually pay for. Increased rate limits, they're not necessarily infinite, but you'll get more of them. So we can potentially flesh this out some more. So I'm just gonna comment this out for now, but just again, just keep that in mind that that's a potential valid use case for that. Okay, any questions on that? Ruby.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. By the way, I want this to be interactive. The reason I'm doing these live is so that you all can ask questions and stop me. And so, if not, I would just pre-record them in the comfort of my own, time slot. So feel free to stop, ask questions, interrupt, say, sound interested. It makes for better viewing for those folks who are watching the YouTube videos. Okay, so again, this was the V1 from last week. This was the V2, which hopefully you did notice ran a little bit faster. And again, I can actually put a Python time stuff in here where I can actually time it, say, have it fetch 10 pages and time how long it took and divide by 10. And that'll tell you the number of requests per second or the number of seconds per request, whatever. You all can do that as well. I think I posted some examples here and there, or they're on my repo of how to use, I think it's basically import time. And you can use that to measure how long it takes. And that way you can have a numerical comparison of how much faster a request is versus sessions. So then towards the end of the call last time, what I started to do is take something like this, the pagination code, which is about 10 lines of code right now, and factor it out into its own little function. And actually, I think this one we just kind of copied and pasted it. I had written it ahead of time. This is something I had posted on Slack before. So you'll notice most of this is the same. It accepts a URL, and it says while URL do a get. So that's this URL here, and I'm saying while URL do a get. The params none, let's skip that for a second. We don't have to really worry about that too much. But then here I'm saying user and users print the user's profile login, whereas here I'm saying for O meaning object, it's a get objects function. For O in res.json, again, similar to this. I'm going to switch kind of back and forth between the left and the right. And I'm using the keyword yield. And again, what yield does is similar to the return keyword in Python. The difference between return and yield is return once and never again. Whereas yield can basically return multiple things in a loop. That's kind of maybe that's not a very technical definition, But it's a good functional definition for the things that we're doing here. So let's say multiple objects in a loop. And that's exactly how we're calling it. This is the test code that calls it. We're saying for user in session.getObjects. Again, method here is called getObjects. And we pass in the URL. We can also pass in a filter and a limit. Those get stuffed into these star params, param, and then get sent down to the actual self.get command. And, and again, this is done in a loop for user in this thing. So if I did a return, if I commented out and did it this way, we would get the first object, but no more. Whereas if we do yield, it's just going to keep returning object after object. Once it does every object in the first page, it's going to figure out the URL from the links. This is similar to the code that we looked at last week, this line here. And if there's another URL, it starts all over again. It fetches the next page and then returns every object in the second page. Then returns and then keeps going and going and going until we get to the last page and then we're done. Make sense? Ooh, I saw a hand go up. Andrew, go ahead.
Can I ask why in the sessions class we need to define post put and patch, since I thought those were already would have been defined by session?
Yeah, absolutely they are. And in fact, you know that they are because I'm calling them super.
Oh.
Yeah, no, but it's a good question, and I didn't get a chance to explain it last week, so I will explain it. So super is my super class. Again, what we're doing here is we're creating a custom class called session, which is a subclass of the request.session. Again, this could be called, Okta session or Gabriel session or my session or whatever, some groovy name. I left the name as it is. It's probably not great. And if you all want to change it or recommend something better, I'm open to it. But I left it that way. The reason I left it that way, by the way, is because it's right here. I'm already calling this Okta request. So having Okta request on Okta session just seemed kind of silly and redundant. So I left it this way. But the super class is the request session, and it indeed does have a post. Again, if we hold down, is it control on the Mac, you guys? Did anybody try this? I'm on Windows. I'm on Windows. When I hold down the control key, you'll notice that the post changes into a little blue hyperlink, and I can click it, and I can drill into it. I'm using VS Code. Did anyone get a chance to try that on their Mac? Is it the control key on Mac as well?
Typically, I'm on a Mac for VS Code. It usually just pops up if I hover over it for a minute. Trying to test.
You'll get this little pop-up here, but you can actually drill into it by just again holding down the control key, or it might be the command key on Mac, I'm not sure, and then clicking it. So
command key.
It's the command key. Okay, figures. Yeah, I know the Mac keyboard shortcuts are always a little bit different, but anyway, hopefully, again, you can all read the documentation on VS Code for that. So if you'll notice, there is a built-in post because I'm calling it. There's also a put and a patch, and there's a delete and a get. But the data signature is a little bit different. It accepts a URL, but then the second argument is data. And we don't typically use that. Almost everything that we do is going to be JSON. So in essence, just to get rid of this data equals none, I created my own where my default argument is just the JSON. So that way you can do something like this. If I uncomment this one out, I can just put in here. If not, I'd have to say JSON equals, and it was basically just to save that 5 extra characters. So yeah,
makes your main function cleaner.
Just a little bit, and again, it's because the requests, we gotta love requests because it's such a great library, but it's it does everything. It's it has thousands of things in it. So if you look at if we go back and look at get, for example, there's one of these. Is it this one here? Yeah, look at the number of arguments. It accepts JSON's at the very bottom because they added it last, probably, I'm guessing. So it has a method, it has a URL, and it has params, and it has data, and it has cookies, blah, blah, blah. almost all the time, I don't use any of these. And again, if you do use them, you can always modify my class. You know, this thing that I wrote was basically to satisfy my own curiosity to figure out how to do it. If it doesn't work for you, if you need to add, you know, cookie equal and pass it down, go for it. You know, this isn't written in stone, you know, brought to you from the mountain. This is just something I threw together because I liked it, and if it doesn't meet the requirements, go ahead and modify it. So, but yeah, it was basically just to clean it up. And you notice here I am saying Jason equals Jason because again, Jason is the second argument. We go back. By the way, you can do again on a PC. It's Alt left shift. Well, sorry, Alt left arrow will go back to the previous function, and Alt right arrow will go forward to the next function, just like when you're browsing on a browser. Again, I'm not sure how the Mac equivalents are. I guess that would also be command potentially. Can't remember if there's an Alt key on Mac. It's been a while since I've used a Mac, but anyway, yeah. So yeah, it was really just to forward that stuff. And similarly, I'm trying to think if there's one more thing I did. You know, I created my own request as well. And that was because what I had done last week, let's comment out this for just a second. What I had done last week is I had made it so that you can pass in a relative URL. You'll notice I'm not saying, you know, base URL here plus, which is what I would have done here, org URL. I called it org URL, but same idea. You can do it that way, but again, it was just a matter of saving a couple of characters, saving a little bit of typing. I'm able to actually pass a relative path because my overridden request method will add the request for you. Sorry, add the org URL for you, and then just call the super request method for you. Make sense?
Yep.
Groovy. And again, I don't want to spend too much time talking about Python object orientation and what super means and what a subclass is. I was trying to find a good video on YouTube this week to recommend to you all who might have those questions. I watched a bunch, and honestly, I didn't like any of them. But you know, I'm sure you can find articles, or you could try one of those videos, and maybe you'll like it better than the ones that I was able to find. But you know, again, this class, these videos that I'm doing, I'm assuming you at least know the basics of Python, and we're really just kind of talking about Okta API specific stuff with requests, creating a subclass of requests, etc. So if there's something that a question that you have that's specific to Python itself, like how do I do subclasses? What does super mean, etc., I'm hoping you'll take the time and the initiative to research that stuff on your own. I can touch on it here and there, but I don't want to really spend too much time on that. Again, for the benefit of those folks who already have some of that knowledge, I won't be repeating it for them. So, and then the other thing I can start to do, which we hinted at earlier, is since I am overriding this request method, we can take the response. I'm going to name this, I'm going to rename this to response. I just hit F2 and it'll allow me to do that. Just, I know it's a little bit longer, but just a little bit more consistent with what I had done here. I was a little more verbose last week and then a little more terse on this side. So let me just make them match. It makes me feel a little bit better. Again, sometimes I choose really short variable names and they're too short. So, you know, it's always a little bit of magic on how long is too long, how short is too short. Comment this out again if I forgot. So one of the things that we can do is, since you know, we have a central choke point, if you will, where every request is going to go through this method. But one of the handy things we can do is we have the response, so we can look at the response headers and pull out the limit, the limit remaining, and the limit reset headers. This one I'm going to convert to an actual date time. The other ones are numeric, so I can convert them to int. And then I can start to do something, you know, real simple, like just print limit and remaining and reset on each call. Kind of silly, but it might be useful, again, since we did talk about rate limits a little bit earlier. But then I can get into, you know, more advanced steps where I can say if remaining is less than 10, then, you know, maybe I want it to sleep. And I think it's time.sleep for a second. Again, we'll make this fancier as we keep going. Okay, so I just imported time, so now I have time.sleep. And you know, and the nice thing is I only have to do that in one place. Why? Because I have, you know, again, subclassed this class and created my own method where everything goes through there. So I can not only have this cool functionality of using relative URLs instead of full URLs, but I can also start to get to some of this other fun stuff like rate limits, which again are handy. And this way we can write them once, put it here, and then never have to worry about it again, which to me is ideal. If you can write a piece of code, use it everywhere, you know, I think is a big win. And this stuff is specific to Okta, but I'm sure you all are probably using other APIs, like maybe Slack's API or Gmail's API or whoever's API. They also might have the concept of rate limits. So maybe you can create, you know, we have here a pretty thin but useful Okta requests Python module. Maybe you can create a Google request module or a O365 or Slack or, you know, Salesforce, whichever other API you want, and you can start to make these sort of customizations in those as well. And then again, you write it once and you use it everywhere. Okay. Any questions on that? I will keep going then. Let me take out these silly comments. Okay, so now let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into this stuff. And I'm not going to risk live coding it, but I do have some examples of stuff that I've done in the past with API rate limits, and it's in a module I wrote called Okta API. I started working on this a long time ago. My first commit was about 4 years ago. And I was relatively new to Python then. I would probably do a lot of things differently today if I were starting from scratch, and that's kind of what we're doing. We're going to start from scratch. So this is a module that I started working on. It's 168 lines of code, but again, a lot of it is copy paste. There's an app section where you can get an app or get all apps, or paginate. You can update an app, et cetera, et cetera. Then it has a section for factors, rinse and repeat. You can get factors, and then actually do a post to get a factor challenge. Then it has a section for groups with a bunch of little method, a mapping section, and then finally a user section. And then down at the bottom, it has some kind of what I call utility functions, like some pagination stuff, which you'll notice, by the way, is done differently than I do it today. Why? Because of what I just explained. This was version 1.0 that I wrote 4 years ago, so maybe 5 years ago even. And since then, I've figured out maybe better ways or different ways of doing it. So this is kind of obsolete, but it still has some interesting stuff in it. So we're getting to the good stuff here, the get limit. Actually, one more quick comment before I do that. So one of the things I was kind of starting to do with this one is, again, eventually this users would have maybe, I don't know, 20 or 50 or 100 endpoints in it, corresponding to basically every single endpoint in the Okta API. I think the Okta API right now has maybe something on the order of 400 or 500 total endpoints. And obviously I only have a few of them here, maybe 20 total. But the idea is over time, I would just keep adding and adding and adding. I could sit down and do all 401 sitting, but that's seems kind of overkill because a lot of those I'm never going to use, or it's going to be a while. So I was just sort of organically adding to them. And again, you're certainly welcome to do this. I think it's still a valid idea. But what I started to realize, if I switch back to VS Code real quick, is it's just almost just as easy just to do something like this. I want to get a user. I'm going to have the the URL here. If I want to update a user, same thing. If I want to add a user to a group, it's really just a one-liner, and it kind of seems silly to me after a while to be creating all these one-liners. So here we go. Add group member would be basically the equivalent of what I'm doing here. Add me to a group. So I thought, well, instead of just adding these one-liners everywhere. Again, I was sort of on the fence about it, but it just seemed kind of silly. It didn't really seem worth it. So I'm thinking these days, just do something like this and you're probably good to go. But again, if you want to, take some of the ideas in this Python file, I'll put the link in the chat window here and, do something with them, go for it. That's fine too. So anyways, so back to where we were starting to go there. I did have a function here called getLimit, but you'll notice it's just a standalone function. It's actually being called by my snooze method, which again, wasn't part of the pipe, if you will. It was something that I had to call, every time I wanted to use it. If I felt like something was gonna potentially have a rate limit, it was gonna get a rate limit error, then I would purposely call the snooze function, which would make it slow down. And what it's doing is it's looking at, okay. Oh, I see. Yeah, it's looking, sorry, it's been a while since I looked at this code. It's saying, what time is it right now? When is it going to reset? And again, hopefully you all are familiar with the way the rate limit headers work in Okta. If not, again, please check the documentation. There's no point in me covering that stuff because it's all right there in the docs. So I say when the reset is greater than the current timestamp, while it's not, just sleep 1 second. And again, I could actually calculate, okay, it's going to reset in 32 seconds, 32.4 seconds. So I can actually just sleep for 32.4 seconds, maybe plus a little bit of delta, round it up to 33 or 34, just to be sure. I didn't do that, but we can certainly do that these days. And so this will do some of the, most of the rate limit stuff for you. But again, it wasn't, in the main pipe. It was something that you explicitly have to call. So what I would do today is just take some of the stuff here and copy it. Actually, this we've already gotten. Take this and sort of merge it back into our main code here. And I'm going to just paste it here for a second. And really what it's going to do then is, again, I have the limit remaining and reset, which I've already fetched here. And I can do the same type of thing. Then if limit is, if the remaining is less than, and I have this basically this, constant with this variable. The reason okay, we've got about 10 minutes left for today. It's giving us a warning. The reason I did it in all uppercase is because that's the standard kind of Python convention for something that's a constant. It doesn't usually change. In fact, I think I may have defined it in this code somewhere. Nope, I guess I passed it in. Never mind. So what this would be typically is maybe something like 10, or some relatively smallish number, but something greater than 0. So the idea is you don't want to wait until you've now run out of rate limits, because that way everybody gets errors. So what I do is, let's say you have a total of 600 per minute. I say, okay, well, I'm going to let you use 590 of those 600. And then the last 10, I'll just keep kind of in the bank. Those could be used by interactive users. If you have administrators using the Okta UI, they'll get rate limit errors too. So you have to be a little bit careful when you start writing scripts. If you're really hammering the API, you can actually lock your admin users out. So my motivation is to never run out of rate limits if possible. It's not always possible, but if possible, to at least leave a little bit left over so other people can get their work done. And again, there's potentially even faster ways or fancier ways, I would say, of doing this, but this was kind of a quick and dirty thing that I do together, and it worked for me. If you need to have, something that has a little more intelligence to it, that's fine too. So, yeah, so that's why I was starting here. If remaining is less than 10, and I'm going to just kind of copy this right now for the time being. But again, we can make it a bit fancier. Okay, I'm going to take this back out again. And now we have something where every single request will check the headers. It'll print the headers out just for fun. If it's starting to run out of headers, it's going to say print sleeping. and then it's going to do this in a loop where it prints, where it sleeps for 1 second at a time, and then just loops on that. And again, I'll just say to do, calculates sleep time. That one you don't really have to do with a loop, but I'll leave that as a to do for now. Any questions on that? Great. So that's a nice little bit of functionality. And again, we can just test this out real quick by calling pagination on here, just to make sure it's actually working. So I'll hit Control F5 and module datetime has no attribute. Oh, I think I have to say datetime, not datetime. Kind of silly the way they did it, but oops. This is deprecated. Back to here, how did we do it here? How do we do this? Yeah, from datetime, import datetime. Let's try this one more time. Just live coding. Always run the risk of seeing weird errors. Okay, it's working. Okay, great. So you can see, I don't know why it's got the line here. I think this is deprecated. Oh yeah, it says right there, sorry. The method UTC from timestamp is deprecated in Python. I'm using Python 3.11 here. So when I wrote the original version 4 years ago, it wasn't deprecated, now it is. So we'd want to find whatever the more recent recommended method is. And again, I always recommend using the Python documentation. I know some people find it hard to read, but to me, it's the most authoritative. And let's see if it says, does anybody see that? Okay, right there, deprecated is version 3.12. Use datetime.from timestamp with UTC instead. So we'd want to change it to from timestamp. And I'm just going to put this here. We'll leave this for another time because again, we're running out of time as always. So I'll just say, let's see this. But you will notice it did work. And again, I basically got that for free by sticking it here. Anytime I do one of these, for session get objects, it's going to check the headers, it's going to print them out, and it's going to potentially sleep. Now, for me to actually get this sleep code to trigger, to get this print sleeping to print, I'm actually going to have to use, you'll notice there's 600 calls per minute, and I have 595 left. So I'd really have to slam that API in order to get those to show up. I'll leave that as an exercise to you all if you want to find a way to test this code to make sure that it works the way I think it works. But I did test it all once upon a time, so I'm fairly confident it would work correctly. Let's see what else. Okay, so that's a quick, this probably won't do everything with rate limits, but I think it's a good enough start. And again, we can always embellish it and go from there. I probably have examples of this that I posted on Slack, but again, unfortunately, Slack's search has been out all day today. It's been really frustrating because I use it all the time. I use it maybe 50 or 100 times a day as I'm answering people's questions and finding old bits of code, and I can't find anything today. So hopefully we'll be back up tomorrow. I know they did put in a ticket with Slack, but yeah, Slack's just not been very cooperative today. So so that's just a quick touching on rate limits. Another thing that we wanted to talk about real quick was CSVs. I know a lot of, it's pretty common for, you could maybe run Rockstar and export a CSV, and then maybe you want to take that in CSV and import it and do something with it. Let's say export all users from a tenant via Rockstar, but then I want to write another Python script to import that CSV file and do something with it. Maybe I'm going to update each user, or I'm going to do something else, or maybe I want to migrate users or groups or applications, any type of object from one Okta tenant to another. So I wrote this quick little import function and export function. And again, my motivation here was, it's only 2 lines of code. This one's only 4 lines of code. But it is kind of a nice little abstraction if you can just pull this four lines of code out, or these 2 lines of code out, and just put them in this module, and then you can reuse it everywhere. Excuse me, and you know, you might even be able to argue, does it really belong in an Okta API Python file? Maybe not, but again, I am using all this stuff, so it just kind of made sense just to put everything in one place. If you want to break it up into multiple Python files and have multiple modules, that's fine too. But yeah, that way you can really easily just call this, and if we click on it, let's see, does it say, okay, so it's telling me that it's being used by this groups.py, and if I open that up, you'll see that I just pass in a file name and I get back a groups iterator, or is it an array or an iterator? It's an array. And then I can just say for group and groups, and I can create a group in Okta using my Okta API method. And again, this is the old school method, which goes back to that first file that we came from. Oops. Here. Right here, again, it's another one-liner that does the session.post to this particular URL. I probably wouldn't do this today, but you're welcome to if you like. So this makes it really simple. You know, it's just a one-liner to import a CSV. Similarly to export a CSV, am I using that anywhere? I'm also using it in that same groups file right here. So I can get all groups that meet a certain criteria, and then I can just export all that stuff to a CSV in one line. And we've got about 3 minutes left. So any questions while we, since we're almost about ready to wrap up? Okay, great. So again, those are defined at the bottom of this file. You could just copy paste those in here and just reuse them as you deem necessary. It'll make your code a little bit cleaner too, because again, you write this once, so just reuse it everywhere that you need to. And then I think, you know, switching topics really quickly, one thing I've noticed, the Python code that I've seen from, you know, you all that have submitted it or have asked me questions, sometimes I get on a Zoom with you and work with you one-on-one. One of the things I noticed is that a lot of the variables don't tend to follow the sort of standard Python naming convention. So for example, functions in Python are done in lowercase with an underscore in between. You wouldn't do something